Thank you, everybody. My name is Diwali. I am a writer. I currently have a short story, Argo Magazine. Check it out. I hear they have really good writers. So I'm going to tell a story about my mom. So the way this story starts is I'm at my parents' house, and I'm sitting on a chair, and my mother is sleeping on a bed. And I'm watching her, and I'm watching her chest rising and falling, and she sort of coughs. And she opens her eyes a little bit and sees me there, looks towards me and says, "Why are you just sitting there? I told you to clean the basement a few hours ago. That's what you should be doing." And yeah, so that was my mom. She was actually dying. She was 60 years old, and she was actually literally on the bed, on her deathbed. And she was laying there on this bed that had the rails on the side, so she wouldn't fall off. It had the gel padding so that she wouldn't get bed sores, and she was lying on this bed worrying about a dirty basement, about an unkempt kitchen, those types of things. So those are the types of things she worried about, and I was sitting there worrying about how I was going to deal with it. So one of the things I did, because this is the type of person I am, is I researched, because research always helps you feel better, right? So I stumbled upon a field, an actual discipline called Thanatology. And it is actually the study of death and dying. And they actually give degrees in it, I think somewhere in Europe somewhere. But, and this study, this field is actually meant to help health professionals and other professionals deal with the fact that pretty much everyone that they work with is going to be dying. Or like sooner, not like in the way that we're all kind of dying, you know, every day kind of thing. Like, this is a happy story, I mean. But anyways, so I researched this. I learned a lot of things. My main reason for looking into it is I wanted to try and be prepared. I wanted to see it coming. I wanted to learn some of the physical signs of when someone starts to get really close. I'm not sure what I thought I was going to do. Like, was I going to run? Was I going to hide? Like, you know, I could see the signs coming. But anyways, I researched it. I learned some really interesting things. So I learned that, what was one of the things I learned? The heart, actually, when someone is getting very close to death, if they're dying slowly, it stops pumping blood all the way out to the extremities, and your limbs actually turn very dark because it's just doing the bare minimum in terms of keeping the heart and the brain going. The other thing I learned is that contrary to like the songs and that Margaret Atwood book, the heart actually doesn't go last. Actually, although the time of death is called when the heart stops, the brain can actually continue firing for up to 5 minutes after the heart has stopped. So that's kind of interesting, something to think about next time you're home alone in the tub or something, you know, just something, fun factoid. The other thing I learned about was these, not phenomena, but more sort of social things, that behaviors that the person that's dying engages in as they start to get near. And these ones are really interesting because some of them I heard about and I thought they were just sort of stories from the old country. One is this thing about a window. When someone is getting very close, like days or hours to death, they insist on a window being open, and there may be no window in the room or no window open. Another thing I read about was someone who was previously bedridden suddenly attempting to try and get up. And, you know, the family's like, "What are you doing, you crazy dying person? Get down, lie down." But, you know, it's something about them actually trying to leave their body but still being tethered to it. And then the other one, which really was a story that I really thought was from the old country, was about being visited or being collected by a loved one. That a loved one that had passed away years prior would suddenly become visible to the person that was close to death, and they would be there to, you know, to come and get them. Like, not like, you know, "I'm gonna come and get you, you know, you're gonna die," you know, like it's supposed to be a good thing. Something like that. So that was actually super interesting to me, and it gave me a little bit of comfort. You know, I was thinking about all these things, and I thought about some of the things my mother had told me about her life, in particular about her own father's death, and how she had her dad, who she was actually quite close to. What I remembered, I was very young when her father passed away, is I remembered her being very, very upset when her father passed away, and I was 4. I didn't understand. I didn't know why she was so very upset. So when I got older one day, I was like, what was going on there, kind of, because I had no idea about death. I didn't know what it was about. And, you know, she had just explained to me that they were very close, and that his death her father's death had been very sudden, and that to this day she's still sort of like, that just really came out of nowhere and it shocked her to her core. So with all of this swimming around in my head, I sort of comforted myself. That was the point of this research. I comforted myself with this, idea that maybe her father would be the one that would come and collect her when it was time to go. And, I kind of pictured her like smacking his arm and being like, what the heck was that about? Like, you just like died. And I was crying and like, what the heck were you trying to do? And so that kind of made me feel a little bit better as she was getting closer and closer. I had some other things that made me feel better, other fantasy kind of things. I had like, images of her like telling me how much she loved me and like the nuances of exactly how she loved me and why she loved me the best. I have 2 siblings, but, and then just like things like, I wanted her to tell me about the day I was born and like skies parting. I was born in April, it always rains on my birthday, so in my head the skies parted, or I wanted her to tell me that kind of stuff, and that's the kind of stuff that made me feel good. Didn't really happen, the whole thing. I don't know if you've read all those viral articles about, top 5 regrets of people dying. They actually spend a lot of time talking about their regrets, and it can be a little depressing sometimes, but happy ending, long story short, you end up you learn from it if you're around people that know that they're dying and they tell you about all the things that they would do differently, like keeping a cleaner basement, which is the beginning of my story. So the other thing that happened as my mother was getting closer to death is her siblings all came from all around the world to be with her. She was the youngest. She had 2 older sisters, 3 older brothers, and 1 other eldest brother that had actually passed away years before she was even born. He was like 5 or something at the time. So all these surviving siblings all came from the UK and from the States, and they all sort of descended on the house. Lovely bunch of 70-year-olds, strong nap game, and afternoon nap game was really strong. And they really, they helped us a lot. They could comfort her in a way that as her children we just couldn't. And we were grateful to have them there. I was very grateful because I had a young family. I have a young family, but then my family was very young. I had a 2-year-old and a 6-month-old baby that were always running around and always screaming. Well, not the 6-month-old baby. They were always screaming. And my time was limited. I couldn't be there with her the way that her siblings could be there. But I was also jealous because they could be there and I couldn't be there. And they were pretty much there 24/7, hearing these funny stories. And for me, the limited time that I could be there, it was actually getting smaller and smaller because even if I was there for a few hours, she would be sleeping for more and more of that time, which was one of the other signs that death was getting very close. So all the other stuff started happening. Her limbs started darkening. Some parts of her body turned yellow because of some of the implications to some of her organs. And then this thing, the death rattle. I don't know if you guys have everyone's heard of the death rattle. I mean, you probably, I don't know if you're like me and you picture like, the skull face and the cloak and holding like a baby rattle. No. So, doesn't sound like a rattle. Anyways, so the death rattle was another thing I had read about, and it's actually pretty interesting. And the reason why this death rattle happens is it's basically an accumulation of fluids in your chest cavity. All of us have got fluids all over our body accumulating right now, but because we're living, they just clear themselves out and nothing gets stuck in one place. But when you're getting very close to death, so close that your heart is no longer pumping all the way out to your limbs, the other thing that no longer is a priority is clearing up this fluid, and it starts to build up and it starts to rattle. So they describe it as a rattle. I came to my mother's house one Tuesday, and I heard what sounded like a machine-like sound. It sounded like metal on metal, whirring kind of. Didn't sound like a rattle. And so I wondered aloud. I was in her room and I was like, is that her oxygen tank? Is that, is it malfunctioning or something? And she kind of opened her eyes and said, no, it's not the O2 tank. That sound is actually coming from my chest, and it's not a good sound. So it was a Tuesday. Usually when that happens, it's very close. The next day was a Wednesday, and I went over with my kids, and my mother was crying. She was very, very upset, and her oldest sister was kind of cradling her, and my mother was kind of clutching her arm, and my mother was actually very afraid. And she knew everything that I knew, even if she didn't know it the same way I knew it. And she was terrified. And in that moment, I looked at her and I thought, you know what? I'm really glad that my granddad isn't coming to get her or collect her or usher her, because I don't think that would have provided her with a lot of comfort at that moment. So the day after, that was a Thursday, got up in the morning, my husband left for work, and then the phone rang and it was my sister, and she just said, you gotta get over here right now. So I drove over, went into the house, and my mother was, she was uncomfortable. So my dad was fanning her, my brother was actually giving her ice chips. A few minutes later, she was uncomfortable, so somebody was helping her kind of switch over because her hips were hurting. And it reminded me so much of me giving birth to my daughter just 6 months earlier. And because when I was giving birth to my daughter, I was ice chips, I was hot 1 second, cold the next, turn me over, stop touching me, all that other kind of stuff. And I thought about one other thing I had learned in the research I'd done into Thanatology about birth and death, and how with birth there's the thinning of the cervix through which the baby comes out, and that some people do believe that death is very similar in that some sort of membrane somewhere thins, so that the person, just for the person who is passing away, and that person can see things or feel things or perceive things that the rest of us can't really do. So she was uncomfortable. We were all there. She had a few things to say to us. After she said everything she needed to say, she fell asleep. And then at about 10 o'clock that night, she passed away. About a month later, everyone else is gone. The house is pretty much empty. All the business is sorted. I'm on the phone with my aunt who'd returned back to England, my mother's sister. I had a habit of calling her every few days because I suddenly needed to record some of our familial recipes. And right in the middle of getting down the correct ratio of cardamom to cinnamon to pepper for our family's chai masala recipe, my aunt suddenly said, "Did she ever tell you about what she saw?" And then I said, "No, I wasn't there enough to hear about what she saw. What are you talking about?" And my aunt said that she rephrased herself and she said, "Did she tell you about who she saw?" And I said, "No, I did not hear any such thing." And my aunt went on to tell me that in those few 4 or 5 days before my mother passed away, when she was sleeping more, she was a little crankier and a little bit more confused than usual, she kept saying, "Who's that little boy?" And initially my aunt said, "That's Logan. Logan's my son, my 2-year-old. And she said, no, it's not him. He's not that small. This is a bigger kid." And my aunts and my uncles just kind of looked at each other and decided to leave her alone. The next time she brought it up, they asked her to elaborate, and she just said that there was a little boy that was sometimes hanging by the door, and that morning he had come all the way to her bed. And no one was telling her who he was, and that she had even said to him, "Who are you? Come here, who are you?" And he just smiled at her and walked away. And what my aunt and I didn't say to each other, but what we both believe, is that little boy might actually have been her brother, this brother that they had that, I don't know where I'm going, I never met the guy, but this brother that she had that passed away way before she was born. And that maybe he was even there the entire time, and that she could only see him as she was getting really close. And that was a very good thought for me, because she would have gotten scared if she'd seen her dad. But she just loved kids so much that the thought of this little child who came to collect her and took her by the hand is something that still gives me good feelings to this day.